The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the walls of the small cabin as Daniel Carter slid out from beneath the frozen crawlspace of the old homestead. He had been lying on his back for nearly an hour, replacing a cracked water pipe that had burst under the night's relentless cold. His breath billowed in pale clouds, dissolving into the snow-heavy air. In the doorway stood Eleanor Price, her frail frame wrapped in a wool blanket that barely reached her knees, blue eyes heavy with exhaustion. She fumbled in her apron for a worn $20 bill, her trembling hands betraying both the chill and her worry. Daniel shook his head, with a quiet smile, refusing the money. "Keep it for heating oil," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who had weathered many storms. The snow was already deepening as he climbed into his old truck, the road ahead disappearing into a curtain of white. Nights like this reminded him just how small a man could feel against the will of nature. He had learned long ago that life rarely offered mercy, but that didn't change his belief. People deserved help simply because they were people. Tonight was no different. He didn't know it yet, but his choice to help without reward would be the first step in a chain of events that would test his endurance, deepen his compassion, and change his life in ways he never imagined. The storm was in full command of the night when Daniel Carter eased his truck onto the narrow, snow-choked road. The headlights cut a dim tunnel through the swirling white, the wipers dragging back and forth in a rhythm that sounded more tired than mechanical. The world beyond the glass was nothing but motion, wind, snow, darkness, and yet, beneath it all, Daniel felt a strange pull to keep moving forward, as though something ahead demanded his presence. He had just left Eleanor Price's cabin, having refused her offer of payment for fixing the burst pipe. It was the kind of small act Daniel had done 100 times in his life without thinking. He lived alone, and his work as a mechanic in this rugged, isolated stretch of Montana didn't exactly make him rich. But what it lacked in profit, it made up for in meaning. His father, gone before Daniel had even reached his teenage years, had taught him one simple creed. If you can help, you help. No applause, no payment necessary. The road curved sharply between two stands of wind-bent pines when Daniel caught it. A sound, faint and sharp, barely audible over the roar of the wind. At first, he thought it was the minch, tires skimming over ice. But then it came again, higher this time, a cry. Daniel pulled the truck over to the side, the tires sinking into a drift. The cold hit him like a wall the second he stepped out, his boots crunching into the deep powder. He cupped his hands around his ears and turned toward the sound. Another cry, followed by a muffled whimper. His pulse quickened. The beam of his flashlight swept across a mound of snow at the roadside, catching on something that didn't belong. A small figure crouched low, barely visible against the white. Daniel moved closer, each step sinking him knee-deep into the drift. It was a boy, no more than 7, his arms wrapped around a bundle clutched so tightly that Daniel could see the strain in his knuckles. Snow clung to the child's lashes, his lips trembling, too hard to form words. The bundle shifted, and a thin, desperate whimper came from inside. "Hey," Daniel said, dropping to one knee so they were eye level. "It's all right, I'm here." The boy said nothing, but his eyes wide and dark followed Daniel's every move. The blanket in his arms was soaked and rimmed with ice. Daniel reached out gently, pulling a edge back just enough to see a newborn's face, red from cold, lips moving faintly as if searching for warmth. A movement in the snow beside them caught Daniel's attention. He turned and saw a woman, lying half buried in the drift, her hair plastered to her face, her breathing shallow and labored. He brushed the snow from her cheek and felt the fever through her chilled skin. "We're going inside," he said firmly, more to himself than anyone else. He lifted the woman into his arms, her weight alarmingly light, and turned toward his truck. "Come on," he called to the boy. For a moment, the child hesitated, clutching the newborn tighter. Then, with a small, determined step, he followed, one hand gripping Daniel's coat. The wind pushed against them like a living thing, but Daniel moved steadily, shielding the plicy woman's face from the snow. The boy climbed into the cab first, still holding the baby, and Daniel settled the woman carefully beside him before slamming the door shut. The heater was already blasting, but the air inside still felt like ice. Within minutes, they reached Daniel's cabin, a modest, single-story place tucked into the Daniel's cabin shelter of a hill. He ushered them inside, the wave of heat from the wood stove wrapping around them instantly. The boy blinked rapidly, as the change in temperature seemed to overwhelm him. Daniel set the baby on the couch, peeling away the sodden blanket and replacing it with a thick quilt he kept folded by the fire. He worked quickly, dipping a cloth into a bowl of warm water and pressing it gently against the baby's small, icy hands and feet. The infant cried softly, but the sound was strong enough to bring relief. The boy remained close to the woman, his gaze flicking between her and the stranger who had just invaded their crisis. Daniel didn't try to explain or make promises. Instead, he handed the boy a dry blanket and nodded toward the fire. The woman stirred slightly when Daniel swapped her soaked coat for one of his heavy sweaters. She murmured something he couldn't catch before settling back onto the pallet he'd laid near the stove. Steam curled from the mugs. Daniel sat on the low table, one within reach of the boy, the other kept warm for her. For a long stretch, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind's assault on the walls. When the woman finally woke enough to focus on her surroundings, her gaze darted to the baby first, then to the boy, and finally to Daniel. Confusion flickered across her expression, before gratitude settled in its place. You brought us in," she whispered, her voice raw from the cold. "You're safe now," Daniel replied simply. "Rest." Her eyes closed again, but not before she managed. "We were trying to reach my sister's place. My husband passed 6 months ago. We stayed in an old barn last night, but the wind took the roof. I tried to keep going, but..." Her words dissolved into exhaustion. Daniel glanced at the boy, who now sat cross-legged on the rug, a blanket draped over his shoulders. His face was pale, but his posture was rigid, like someone who had been forced to grow up far too fast. "What's your name?" Daniel asked gently. "Noah," the boy said after a pause. His voice was soft but steady. "And your brother?" "Eli." Daniel nodded, letting the name settle into the warm air of the cabin. "All right, Noah. Eli's warming up, fine. Your mom will, too." For the next hour, Daniel kept the fire fed, the cabin's warmth wrapping around them like a shield against the storm outside. Noah didn't speak again, but Daniel caught him watching closely whenever he adjusted Eli's blanket or checked the woman's breathing. At one point, Daniel felt the boy's eyes on him longer than usual. When he glanced back, Noah didn't look away. There was no smile, but something had shifted, a thread of trust, beginning to form, delicate yet unmistakable. Outside, the blizzard raged on, swallowing the world in white. But inside, in that small, wood-walled room, there was heat, safety, and a fragile beginning of connection between three strangers brought together by a storm. Daniel didn't know how long they'd be snowbound or what lay ahead once the wind calmed. All he knew was that they were here now, alive, and that was enough. The rest could wait. Until morning. The storm showed no sign of loosening its grip. For days, the world outside Daniel Carter's cabin was nothing but a churning sea of white, the wind pressing against the walls like an uninvited guest determined to force its way in. The windows had long since frosted over, blurring any sense of horizon, and the drifts outside had risen nearly to the sills. It was clear. They were not going anywhere until nature decided otherwise. Inside, the cabin became a small, self-contained world. Grace, still pale, but steadily recovering from her fever, spent most of her time resting near the wood stove, Eli curled in her arms. The baby's breathing had grown steadier, his cheeks touched with a faint blush of warmth instead of the alarming pallor from that first night. Noah was another story. The boy carried himself with a guarded watchfulness, always hovering near his mother or his brother, as though expecting the storm or perhaps Daniel to somehow take them away. He accepted blankets, food, and warmth, but his eyes measured every kindness before allowing it to sink in. Daniel didn't push him. He'd learned long ago that trust wasn't something you could demand, it was something you earned by showing up, day after day. Instead of asking questions, he built routines that the boy could see and understand. In the mornings, Daniel would stoke the fire back to life, the sharp scent of burning pine filling the air. He'd stir a pot of oatmeal on the stove, sprinkling in cinnamon when the pantry allowed, and set a steaming bowl in front of Noah without fanfare. Sometimes, Grace would give the faintest nod, and only then would Noah pick up the spoon. Daniel made it a point to share small pieces of his own life, not grand stories, just moments. One morning, while Grace dozed, he told Noah about the winter when his family farm was buried in snow for an entire week. "We had to tie a rope from the house to the chicken coop," he said, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Otherwise, you couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. My dad said even the chickens were braver than we were." Noah's spoon paused halfway to his mouth, and for a flicker of a moment, the corners of his lips twitched into something dangerously close to a smile before he quickly hid it behind. Another bite. Grace, watching quietly from her spot by the fire, caught Daniel's eye. There was a softness there now, gratitude that didn't need words. Afternoons were filled with practical lessons. While Grace and Eli rested, Daniel would show Noah how to stack firewood so the snow wouldn't soak it, or how to bank the fire so it would last through the night without constant tending. The boy listened intently, his small hands fumbling at first, but growing surer each day. Daniel noticed the change in his questions, too. At first, Noah's words were short and cautious, mostly about his mother or his brother. But as the days passed, he started asking about the tools hanging on the wall, the rifle above the mantel, and whether the chicken's in. Daniel's story had really made it through that blizzard. Sometimes, Daniel would give him an extra slice of bread, slipping it onto his plate with a plate wink when Grace wasn't looking. Noah never said thank you aloud, but there was a quiet acknowledgement in the way he no longer looked away when Daniel spoke to him. On the third night, long after the fire had settled into a steady glow, Daniel woke to the faint rustle of movement. He rose from his bedroll to find Noah sitting by the stove, Eli in his lap. The boy was trying to wrap one of the smaller quilts around the baby, his fingers clumsy with sleep. Here, Daniel murmured, crouching beside him. He took a towel he'd warmed near the stove and wrapped it snugly around Eli's chest and feet. This will hold the heat longer. Noah's eyes, wide in the flickering firelight, met his. You did good, Daniel said softly. Keeping him close like that, you probably kept him from getting worse. The boy didn't answer, but he didn't pull away either. He stayed beside Daniel until Eli's breathing evened out again, and when Daniel adjusted the blanket one last time, Noah let him. By the fourth day, the snow outside had risen so high that opening the front door took effort. Daniel managed only to push it far enough to see that the road was gone entirely, replaced by an unbroken sheet of white stretching into the distance. He closed the door against the cold and stood for a long moment, looking at Grace and the two sleeping children curled together on the rug. Grace stirred, her eyes meeting his. No words passed between them, but the message was clear. They were snowbound, and survival depended on the small world they had built together inside these four walls. The cabin became a rhythm fire, food, quiet conversation, and the unspoken understanding that they were in this together. The howling wind outside might have been 100 miles away for all it mattered. Inside, the crackle of the fire and the slow breath of sleeping children became the sound of safety. Noah no longer hovered at the edges of the room. He took to sitting at the table while Daniel worked with his tools, sometimes holding nails, sometimes just watching, but always close enough to feel part of whatever was being done. Daniel didn't say it aloud, but he knew the shift when it happened. The moment Noah stopped seeing him as just a stranger and started seeing him as someone who belonged in their fragile circle of trust. And in the quiet, storm-lit nights, when the snow pressed so hard against the walls, it seemed the whole world might vanish. Daniel found himself watching them too, Grace, Noah, and Eli, realizing that somewhere between the first cry in the blizzard and now, they had become more than people he was helping. They had become his responsibility. And in the solitude of that cabin, it was a responsibility he was determined not to fail. It was deep in the hours before dawn when Daniel Carter woke to a sound that wasn't the wind. At first, he thought it might have been the creak of the cabin settling under the weight of snow, but then it came again, short, uneven gasps, fragile and desperate. He sat up, instantly, scanning the dim room lit only by the low glow of the wood stove. Grace was already upright, her face pale, cradling Eli against her chest. Something's wrong, she whispered, her voice tight with fear. Daniel crossed the room in 2 strides and brushed the baby's cheek. The skin was icy to the touch, far too cold, and the bluish tint around his tiny lips made Daniel's stomach twist. Eli's breathing was shallow, each breath a struggle. He didn't need a medical degree to know. They had no time to lose. He stoked the fire with one hand while pulling on his coat with the other. We need to get him to a doctor. Now. Grace shook her head, clutching Eli tighter as if her arms alone could keep him alive. The road, she began, but before she could finish, the old landline on the wall crackled to life. The voice on the other end was from the county rescue unit, muffled through static. Every road was blocked, and no plow could reach them for at least 5 hours. Grace's eyes went wide, tears glistening. He doesn't have 5 hours. Daniel didn't argue. He dropped the receiver back on its hook and went to the chest by the door, pulling out a heavy wool blanket. Wrapping Eli in it until only his small face showed, Daniel tightened the folds with a leather belt to keep the warmth in. "There's a clinic on the far side of the ridge," he said, fastening the last buckle. "It's a hike, but I can make it faster than any plow." Grace's hand caught his arm. "I'm coming." They stepped into the storm together, the door slamming shut behind them as the wind grabbed at their clothes like claws. Snow clawed at their legs, each step sinking them deeper, the bitter cold stinging any exposed skin. Daniel kept Eli tucked inside his coat, close enough to feel the baby's faint breaths against his ribs. Grace moved beside him, her hand pressed against his back to steady herself against the gusts. An hour into the trek, the snow was past their knees. Grace's breath came in ragged bursts, her strength fraying with each step. Daniel glanced over his shoulder and saw her stumble, catching herself against a half-buried fence post. The color had drained from her face, her lips trembling as she gasped. "We can't stop." But Daniel knew the truth. If they didn't find shelter soon, she wouldn't make it. Scanning the white void around them, his eyes caught the dark outline of a small hunting shack, half collapsed, but still standing. He guided her toward it, forcing the swollen door open with his shoulder. Inside, the air was still frigid, but free from the wind's bite. Daniel knelt before Grace, his voice low but firm. "Stay here. Keep him wrapped. If you can, get a fire going in that stove. I'll come back for you." Grace's eyes searched his face, torn between fear and trust. After a long moment, she nodded. Noah stumbled in behind them, his cheeks raw from the cold, eyes locked on his baby brother. Daniel crouched to meet Noah's gaze. "I'll bring him back safe," he promised, steady and certain. Noah hesitated, his small frame stiff as if ready to block the door, but then he stepped aside. Back into the blizzard Daniel went, scarf pulled high, Eli cradled against his chest. The snow was heavier now, the wind sharper, each step a battle. Somewhere deep in his chest, he repeated the same phrase over and over. "You are not too late." The ridge rose before him like a wall, the climb stealing what little breath the cold had left him. His legs burned, his lungs ached, but he kept going, driven by the fragile weight in his arms. When he finally crested the ridge, a faint golden glow appeared through the swirling snow, the lights of the clinic. That sight gave him the strength to half run, half slide down the slope. By the time he reached the door, his hands were numb and his coat stiff with ice. He pounded until it swung open and warm hands took Eli from him. The nurse's voice was brisk, calling for oxygen, warm blankets, and a heat lamp, but Daniel heard the relief beneath her tone. Only when the faintest pink began to return to Eli's lips did Daniel let himself exhale fully. "You got him here just in time," the doctor said, clapping a hand on his shoulder. Daniel could only nod, too overcome to speak. He stood there until Eli's breathing was slow, and even the rattle gone from his tiny chest. Hours later, the storm still raging, Daniel made the return trip with 2 rescue volunteers. The path was treacherous, but knowing Grace and Noah were waiting pushed him onward. They found the shack easily enough, the faint smoke from its stovepipe marking it against the play white. Inside, Grace and Noah were huddled close to the small fire, their faces lighting up the instant they saw him. Grace didn't need to ask about Eli, she read the answer in his eyes. Noah stepped forward, looking up at Daniel with something new in his gaze, not just relief, but trust, solid and unspoken. They made the last leg of the journey together, trudging through the snow back to the clinic. When Grace finally held Eli again, now swaddled and sleeping peacefully, she pressed her lips to his forehead and whispered, "My baby. You're safe." Daniel stood a few feet away, the heat of the room soaking into his bones. For the first time in days, the storm outside felt like something distant, as if it had finally lost its power over them. In that moment, Daniel knew the truth. Sometimes survival wasn't about skill or strength alone, it was about refusing to give up, no matter how impossible the road ahead seemed. And that night, on the far side of the ridge, he had refused. The clinic was warm compared to the blizzard raging outside, the air tinged with a faint mix of antiseptic and the comforting scent of wood smoke from the iron stove in the corner. Grace sat on a narrow cot, Eli sleeping soundly in her arms, his breathing now slow and steady. Noah perched beside her, boots swinging just above the floor, his eyes fixed protectively on his little brother. Daniel Carter had stepped out to speak with the nurse about supplies when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air and a swirl of snow. Martha Hughes entered, her heavy coat dusted white, scarf pulled tight around her chin. Her gaze immediately found Grace, and she crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, as though weighing her words before speaking. "I heard what happened," Martha said softly, settling into the chair opposite Grace. Her weathered hands, still red from the cold, reached for Grace's and held them for a moment. "You did the right thing bringing him here. You fought the storm and you made it." Grace gave a small, weary smile. "I had help," she murmured, glancing toward the doorway, where Daniel had disappeared. Martha's eyes drifted to Eli, her expression tightening with an old memory. "I lost my boy in a blizzard like this, years ago. He was 5. Fever took him in a single night while the roads were closed. If I'd had the choice, I would have sent him to stay with family in town before the storm hit." Her voice wavered, just enough to betray the depth of the wound. She paused before continuing, her tone gentle but heavy with concern. "Maybe you should think about letting your sister take Eli for a little while. Just until the weather breaks. So you can keep him safe." The words hung in the air like a cold draft slipping through a cracked window. Grace's arms tightened instinctively around her son. "I don't know," she said quietly. "It's not easy to be apart from your child." Neither woman noticed the small figure in the doorway to the hall. Noah had been chasing a stray rubber ball down the corridor, and had returned just in time to hear Martha's last sentence. He froze, his hand resting on the doorframe, heart thudding hard in his chest. "They're going to take Eli away." The thought landed like a stone in his mind, sharp and unshakable. His stomach tightened as an image formed, Eli bundled in blankets, carried out into the snow, his small cries fading into the wind. Noah remembered all too clearly the night his father had been taken away in an ambulance, never to return. He had promised himself then that he would never let anyone take his brother from him. Inside, Grace was trying to smooth the conversation back toward warmth. "I appreciate your kindness, Martha. Truly. But right now, I need to keep him close." Martha nodded, recognizing the quiet defiance in Grace's tone. She reached out to touch Eli's cheek before standing. "I just want you to think about it. Sometimes love means trusting others to help carry the weight." Grace gave a faint nod, already distracted by the paperwork the nurse had left for her. Medical notes, temporary address forms, emergency contacts. She didn't see Noah slip away, his face carefully blank. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Daniel returned with extra blankets and a thermos of hot broth, settling into a chair in the corner while Grace tried to rest. The storm outside had eased to a steady fall of snow, but the temperature had dropped even lower. The clinic's generator hummed, and the staff moved quietly through the halls. Noah stayed close to Eli's side, fetching water when Grace asked, keeping one hand on the baby's blanket as though his touch alone could anchor his brother there. When Daniel offered to take him downstairs to see the rescue sleds, Noah shook his head. "I'll stay here." By nightfall, the clinic's corridors were dim, lit only by desk lamps and the low glow from the stove. Grace had drifted into sleep in the chair beside Eli's crib, one hand resting on the baby's blanket. Across the room, Noah lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling while Martha's words replayed in his mind. "Send Eli to your sister for a while." In his imagination, the sentence twisted into something colder, more final. If he didn't act now, someone would take Eli away before morning. Carefully, he slid from the cot, wrapping a wool blanket around his shoulders. Lifted Ellie from the crib, the baby stirring with a soft, questioning sound. "Shh," Noah whispered, pressing his cheek to his brother's head. "I'm keeping you safe." The side exit was stiff with ice, but he forced it open, the cold slamming into him with brutal force. For a moment, he almost turned back. Almost. But the fear in his chest pushed him forward into the night, the snow swallowing his small frame as he carried Eli into the mace. Blizzard. Upstairs, by one of the clinic windows, Martha stood with a cooling mug of tea in her hands. She thought she saw movement, a shadow hunched against the wind. Leaning closer, her breath caught. It was Noah. And he had the baby. The mug clattered into the sink as she called down the hall, "Daniel. He's outside, he's got Eli." Somewhere in the building, Daniel was already grabbing his coat. Daniel Carter was already halfway into his coat when Martha's shout reached him. Grabbing a lantern, he plunged into the night without hesitation, Martha right behind him. The wind cut like knives against their faces, the snow swirling so thick it erased the world beyond a few steps. Still, they pressed forward, following the faint, uneven footprints that wove through the four drifts. Several times, the trail nearly disappeared where the snow had already begun to fill it in, but Daniel's eyes were sharp. A scuff patch near a fence post, a shallow drift with the imprint of small boots, he read them like a lifeline. The wind roared in his ears, but the thought of Noah and Eli out here kept his legs moving. At last, they spotted the outline of an old storage shed, half buried and groaning under the weight of snow. Daniel pushed the swollen door open, the lantern light spilling into the bitterly cold space. There, on the floor, Noah sat with Eli in his lap, the baby's small face tucked under a blanket. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, crouching low. "That's a long walk in this weather. Your brother's cold. We need to get him warm." Noah's jaw was set tight. "You're just going to take him away?" Daniel shook his head, removing his coat and draping it over both boys. "When I was your age, I carried my sick little sister through a storm to the neighbors. They didn't take her away, they just kept her safe. Families stick together, Noah. Always. I'm here to make sure you both get through this." The shed groaned above them, a deep warning crack splitting the night. Snow sifted down from the rafters. Daniel met Noah's eyes. "If we stay here, we might not get another chance." After a long moment, Noah gave a small nod. Daniel scooped Eli into his arms, feeling the large baby's faint breath against his neck, while Martha gripped Noah's hand. They pushed back into the storm. And just minutes after they cleared the door, the shed's roof caved in with a thunderous crash swallowed instantly by the blizzard. The day after the rescue, something subtle but undeniable had changed between Noah and Daniel Carter. Where once there had been a guarded distance, there was now an unspoken thread of trust. Noah no longer kept himself wedged between his mother and baby brother whenever Daniel entered the room. Instead, he followed Daniel with quiet curiosity, watching how he split kindling or tested the latch on the clinic's back door to keep the cold from creeping in. Word of the blizzard ordeal spread quickly through the small town. By midday, neighbors began arriving at the clinic, carrying casseroles wrapped in towels, jars of soup, bags of dashna, blankets, and offers of anything else the family might need. One man mentioned an old riverside cottage weathered and drafty, but still standing, that could be fixed up. The suggestion lit a spark in the room, and soon the townsfolk were mapping out repairs, hauling lumber, and scavenging supplies from barns and sheds. Daniel was there from the first nail driven. He showed Noah how to hold a hammer without smashing his fingers, how to measure and cut boards so they fit cleanly into the frame, and how to pack insulation into the walls to keep the wind from slipping through. At first, Noah's small hands trembled with the effort, but Daniel never took the tools away. "You'll get it," he said, his tone patient and steady. Grace watched from the doorway, Eli bundled in her arms, the sight of her son working alongside Daniel stirring something deep inside her. It wasn't just gratitude, it was the relief of seeing Noah's shoulders no longer hunched under invisible weight. The boy even started laughing now and then, the sound sharp and bright against the winter air. Days passed in a rhythm of building and learning. In the mornings, Daniel would arrive with a thermos of coffee for Grace and a smaller one of cocoa for Noah. They'd work until their breath smoked in the frigid light, then retreat inside for bowls of stew that neighbors dropped, off in an endless rotation. The cottage slowly transformed. New boards sealed the roof, fresh cut wood stacked neatly by the stove, and curtains sewn from donated fabric hung in the windows. One afternoon, as they stood side by side sanding a doorframe, Noah spoke without looking up. "You're coming for dinner tomorrow, right?" It was the first time he'd invited Daniel. Without prompting, Daniel smiled, brushing sawdust from his gloves. "Wouldn't miss it." 2 weeks after the storm, the little house smelled of fresh wood and bread baking in the grater oven. The kitchen filled with voices and the clatter of borrowed dishes as neighbors crowded in to celebrate. Grace moved easily among them, her face brighter than Daniel had yet seen, while Noah proudly showed off the sturdy woodpile he'd helped stack. As the evening wound down, Martha found Daniel standing a little apart, watching Grace and the boys settle into their new space. She laid a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't just fix a house," she said quietly. "You fixed some hearts." Daniel didn't answer right away, his gaze lingering on Noah, who was leaning over Eli's crib, whispering something only the baby could hear. In that moment, Daniel realized he had crossed an invisible line. He wasn't just the man who had found them in the snow, he had become part of their circle, woven into the daily pulse of their lives. Later that night, back at his own cabin, Daniel hung his gloves on the peg by the door. He reached into his bag and pulled out a tiny knit glove, one Noah had accidentally left behind during the move. Setting it carefully on the shelf, he sat at his workbench and picked up a small piece of pine. With steady hands, he began crafting a wooden chair sized for a toddler, each stroke of the blade a quiet promise that, storm or no storm, he wasn't going anywhere. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady, but inside there was a rhythm of warmth, taking root, something more enduring than the cold could ever touch. The riverside cottage stood warm and bright against the winter dusk, its windows glowing with the soft gold of firelight. Inside, laughter filled the rooms. Grace chatting with neighbors in the kitchen, Noah proudly stacking firewood by the stove, and baby Eli gurgling from his crib. The smell of fresh bread and pine lingered in the air, blending with the hum of voices. Daniel Carter stood quietly by the door for a moment, taking it all in, knowing this home was more than just walls and a roof. It was safety, renewal, and the beginning of a new chapter for a family that had fought through the storm together. Later, back at his own cabin, Daniel hung his coat and gloves, the silence wrapping around him like a familiar friend. On his workbench lay a small piece of smooth pine. He picked it up and began carving, the shape of a tiny wooden chair slowly emerging under his steady hands. It would be for Eli a gift, but also a symbol of the bond they had forged in those long, frozen days. Outside, snow fell softly, but inside, the rhythm of his tools carried the quiet warmth of knowing that even in the harshest storms, connection could take root and last. Sometimes, the greatest shelters in life aren't built from wood or stone, they're built from trust, compassion, and the simple choice to stand by someone when the world outside is cold. If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts in the comments, hit the like button, and subscribe so you won't miss more stories that remind us what truly matters. Together, let's keep the warmth alive.